When many people think of the Cold War, they picture nuclear proliferation, the space race, all these really grand and somewhat abstract gestures that feed the narrative of a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's also remembered as a sense of shared dread, one that taught school children that invisible enemies could literally bear down from the sky at any moment. It goes really unrecognized the involvement other countries like China had in the Cold War. The relationship between the US and China during this time was a relationship characterized by isolation, more so than interaction. As A. Bernays observed in a 1977 book, there was no formal diplomatic ties, no trade, no legal travel back and forth, and virtually no mutual contact between ordinary citizens of the two countries. Probably never in the modern period have two major societies been so isolated from each other for so long in peacetime, if the Cold War could be considered peace. Understanding how the United States and China went from two countries with minimal interaction, how we got from there to the modern day scenario where we have a great deal of trade, just think of how common it is that something be labeled made in China, and all of the connotations that that label holds. You also have a great deal of competition and a great deal of immigration, but it's important to understand what the picture looked like during the Cold War and how people are educated on that history. Because we in the US still do hold a lot of fear, definitely, and sometimes hatred for the unfamiliar. And in spite of the massive amounts of interaction the US and China now have, we still hold on to that sense of unfamiliarity. When you think about how we talk about China, the lines of communication are blocked. Just this week, the US shot down a Chinese airstrip which turned out to be an unmanned weather balloon that blew into US airspace. That's what Chinese officials claim, but then you have the US news, which calls it a suspected Chinese spy balloon. That's a direct quote from CSNBC. So you take an unidentified balloon with no one and no weapons on it, flying over a beach in Southern California, but hey, maybe it was spies. By casting that suspicion, you can avoid saying that the US government did anything wrong. But rewinding all the way back to this relative isolation in the 1950s and 60s and even earlier, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which banned any laborers from immigrating from China. This is completely unprecedented. There was nothing like it before in American history, and there hasn't been anything like it since. In 1943, the ban ended, but because of how immigration quotas were structured at that time, only about 105 Chinese immigrants were allowed per year. The Chinese Exclusion Act makes what little immigration there was particularly impactful in terms of how Americans viewed Chinese immigrants, and vice versa. For Chinese Americans living in the United States during the Cold War, particularly San Francisco, which had one of the largest Chinese American populations, the Cold War provoked a whole different set of additional fears. For them, there was a strong sense of awareness on how the US treated Japanese Americans during World War II. Chinese veterans took part in anti-communist marches. Businesses cut off advertising deals with left-leaning newspapers. Even children participating in the 1951 Chinese New Year Parade waved banners that read, "Rid the world of communism." It cannot be said to what extent these choices were the results of closely held patriotic values as opposed to the fear of prosecution. But either way, they led to increased goodwill towards Chinese people in San Francisco. Ultimately, this goodwill accumulated in 1956 when a bill was signed into effect allowing paper sons and daughters to confess their illegal status in exchange for leniency or even a path to naturalization. Of course, speaking of diplomacy, the US made numerous attempts of their own to control their reputation, at home and abroad. One strategy the US deployed during the Cold War was to utilize linguistic experts, sending them abroad to teach the English language, which was a highly desirable skill set. This also presented an opportunity to incorporate anti-communist sentiments and spread goodwill towards the United States. Language impacts our beliefs and habits in really subtle but powerful ways. Much anti-communist rhetoric is a matter of separating the self from the other. This is also a part of language acquisition. Most words have a cognitive charge, and many biases are as innate as the language we use to express them. Seeing how the US not only taught its own historical narrative in schools, but strategically spread its agenda abroad through the English language is crucial for understanding how the US narrative of the Cold War came to be the dominant one globally.
History is memory, and many Americans today have a completely skewed understanding of the Cold War and how it affected Asian Americans or future US-China relationships. This can be attributed to the fact that the conflict is not taught much in US schools until kids are in high school, usually by the end of their senior year. There's no discussion of it in the formative years of school. Despite history still being taught, most U.S. schools focus on national and state history rather than global wars and conflicts. It can be argued that this is because talking about conflicts like this to young children would be too insensitive or too complex, but a major part of U.S. history that is taught is Native American eradication and Black enslavement, of which schools present a very censored and whitewashed view of this account. So this begs the question, why not talk about the Cold War if other brutal topics are discussed? It partly has to do with the structure of the U.S. education system. Teachers don't have enough time to talk about this massive geopolitical conflict once they've hit all the points in their structured curriculum and they don't get to design their own curriculum. The omission of the Cold War may have to do with how the American memory of the U.S. role in the Cold War is associated with shame. For example, the U.S. lost the Vietnam War, but instead it's taught it chose to pull out for diplomatic reasons. The US brutally prosecuted Southeast Asian, African, and Middle East countries who were interested in leftist politics, and to this day, the US involvement is referred to as containment in the interest of preserving freedom. US organizations such as the CIA were created not to preserve American security, but to disrupt the politics of other countries and continue the ideological manifest destiny that has been characteristic of the US since it first formed its own identity as an independent country. In cases where the Cold War is taught, another problem lies in the way that it's done. The conflict is presented from an Americentric or Eurocentric view, prioritizing the fear that white Americans felt as children, while being presented media that told them that non-white countries wanted to bomb them. It's taught in terms of the Western world and the non-Western world, terms alone that say there's us with our capitalistic society, and then there are them, who is the enemy. Nuclear fallout fear is attributed to the Soviet Union, but the US portrayed China as the lesser and incapable stooge of its real enemy, the USSR. US diplomats and government officials who traveled to China during the conflict regularly described the country as weak and in awe of its Soviet neighbor, when in reality they followed completely separate ideologies, and China self-sufficiently, after removing all of its Soviet military officers, became a nuclear power in 1964. So in reality, the Chinese and Soviet ideal of communism was vastly different, and the two countries had a brief mini-Cold War of their own, each one criticizing the other's approach. China called the Soviet Union revisionist, and the Soviets claimed Chinese communism simply wasn't communist, with its more rural rather than industrial approach.
For the subject history specifically, the content of the Cold War is always mandatory for either middle school or high school and is usually taught in grade 9. In one textbook example from the Chinese education system, the Cold War was taught in grade 9, included in the first unit with the title Changes in the World After World War II. According to the teacher's version of this textbook, the requirement for this material was to firstly know the background of the Cold War, and secondly, know how the Cold War began through the Truman Doctrine and the Iron Curtain speech, and learn about the formation of the bipolar pattern through the historical facts such as the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Crisis, the division of Germany, and the establishment of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. In general, after the end of the Second World War, the world landscape underwent significant changes, and the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union changed from wartime allies to adversaries, resulting in a new post-war pattern of international relations characterized by the Cold War. The textbook first introduces the background of the growing confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union after the war. After World War II, the United States became the most militarily and economically powerful country in the world. Hundreds of military bases around the world and a capitalist international trade system centered on the US dollar were built up, showing a strong desire for hegemony. Meanwhile, the influence of socialism expanded, and the Soviet Union's international prestige increased greatly, and was seen by the United States as the greatest enemy of the global hegemony. The United States then spearheaded the Cold War against the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union countered. The antagonism of the US and Soviet Union national strategies and the vast differences in social systems led to increasing confrontation between the two sides. Then the textbook uses the Iron Curtain speech and the Truman Doctrine as examples to illustrate the beginning of the Cold War. According to the textbook, the Iron Curtain speech was set to review the cover of the Cold War, and the introduction of the Truman Doctrine marked the formal breakup of the US-Soviet wartime alliance and the beginning of the Cold War. In the end of this unit, there is a part called Reading Card that is attached with a piece of reading titled Out of Touch, Unpopular US Hegemony. It criticizes the hegemonic behavior of the United States, taking the example of the United States being mired in the Vietnam War, and the Arab oil exporting countries using oil as a weapon to hit the United States hard during the Fourth Middle East War. It shows that the United States hegemony was harmful to others and was opposed by people all over the world, including the American people.
Secondary school is an important period for students to form a correct view of history. History textbooks serve as the main basis and important carrier of ideology. First, we want to introduce the basic education system in China. China has a completely different education system compared to that in the US. China, a 9-year compulsory education system which covers from grade 1 to grade 9, includes subjects like Chinese, mathematics, English, science, moral education, and history. After grade 9, when middle school education is done, the following advanced education is optional. In the year of 2010, 82.5% of the students choose to complete the 3-year high school education. During high school, the same subject as those in 9-year compulsory education will be taught with more detailed and advanced content, so as to let the students seek where their interests were and which paths to go in.